He came to the wedding wearing the only suit he owned, expecting to sit quietly in the back and leave before anyone noticed him. Callum Voss, a 41-year-old single father, had no date, no wealthy friends, and no reason to believe the night would change his life. Then the ballroom doors opened. An elegant billionaire woman in her late 50s walked straight past dozens of powerful men and stopped beside his lonely table. "Mr. Voss," she whispered, "I have been looking for you for 3 years." Callum froze. He had never met her in his life. But when she placed an old photograph on his table, his entire past suddenly became dangerous. The ballroom glittered like something out of another century, all gold trim and crystal light spilling across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. It belonged to one of the oldest hotels in Manhattan, the kind of place where old money and new money learned to speak the same quiet language. Hundreds of guests moved through the room in tuxedos and evening gowns, their laughter rising and falling like a tide that never quite reached the far corners. Investors traded business cards disguised as pleasantries. Attorneys complimented each other's watches. Entire dynasties of inherited wealth stood beside self-made executives, each group performing a kind of practiced ease that only comes from decades of being watched. Near the back of the room, far from the string quartet and the cascading flowers, Callum Voss sat alone at a small round table meant for 6. He was 41, though the weariness in his eyes made him look older, and nothing about him matched the glittering crowd around him. His suit was clean but clearly not new, the kind a man buys once and makes last for a decade. His watch was plain, the kind that told time and nothing else. He had come with no driver waiting outside, no assistant trailing behind him, no circle of admirers pretending to laugh at his jokes. He had come because the groom, a man named Grant Ashford, had once been his closest friend. Back before Callum's life had taken a quieter and much harder turn. Callum was not envious of the room around him. He had not come to be seen, and he had no interest in impressing anyone. He simply wanted to watch his old friend get married, offer a sincere congratulation, and slip out before the dancing began. But rooms like this one had a way of noticing outsiders, the way a held breath notices a draft. A guest passing by paused at his table and asked, almost lazily, whether he belonged to the bride's side of the family. Callum answered simply that he was only an old friend of the groom's, and the guest gave a small, knowing smile before moving on, the kind of smile that already had an opinion formed. A well-dressed man a few tables away overheard the exchange and chuckled under his breath to his companion, not bothering to lower his voice enough. Callum felt the weight of it settle over him, not anger, just a familiar tiredness, the tiredness of a man who had learned long ago that rooms like this one were never built for people like him. He glanced once toward the head table, where Grant Ashford stood laughing beside his new bride, radiant and untroubled. And Callum allowed himself a small, genuine smile for his old friend, before looking away again. He decided it was time to leave. He set down his water glass, pushed back his chair, and began to rise, already rehearsing the short, polite exit he would give if anyone asked. He thought, not for the first time that evening, about how easily a room could be divided without a single word being spoken aloud, how a man's suit or his watch, or the absence of a car waiting outside, could quietly announce where he belonged and where he did not. It had never bothered him the way it might have bothered someone still chasing a version of success he had long since set aside. He had built a different kind of life, smaller and steadier, and most nights that was enough. But standing in a ballroom built entirely on the currency of appearances, even a settled man could feel, for a moment, like a stranger to his own confidence. That was the moment the room changed. The steady hum of conversation near the entrance folded into a hush, spreading outward table by table like a ripple moving across still water. Every head turned toward the ballroom doors. A woman had entered, tall and composed, dressed in a black gown, so simple it made every sequin dress in the room look desperate by comparison. She needed no introduction. Everyone in that room already knew exactly who she was. Her name was Serafina Vale, 58 years old, chief executive of the Vale Meridian Group, one of the most powerful and most guarded financial empires on the East Coast. She was known for her precision, her silence, and her near-total absence from social gatherings of any kind. Executives who had waited years for a single private meeting with her stood frozen now. Watching her walk into a wedding she had no obvious reason to attend, and yet she did not glance toward the bride. She did not look for the groom. She did not so much as nod toward the cluster of chief executives, already angling to catch her eye. Her gaze moved directly to the back of the room, to the small table where a stranger in a modest suit had just risen to leave. Serafina Vale began walking straight toward Callum Voss. And every person in that ballroom, including Callum himself, had no idea why. Serafina crossed the ballroom without hesitation, her heels striking the marble in a steady rhythm that seemed to silence the room further with every step. Waiters paused mid-stride. Conversations dissolved into half-finished sentences. By the time she reached the small back table, Callum was standing, caught between leaving and staying, unsure which impulse to trust. He straightened instinctively, the way people do in the presence of someone whose authority fills a room before she even speaks. She studied him for a long moment, longer than politeness usually allowed, as though she were confirming something she had already decided was true. Then she asked, quietly but clearly, "Are you Callum Voss?" He answered that he was, his voice steady despite the unfamiliar attention now fixed on him from every direction. Without waiting for an invitation, Serafina pulled out the empty chair across from him and sat down, an act so unexpected that a ripple of whispers moved through the surrounding tables. Billionaires did not sit with strangers. They summoned people to their tables, not the other way around. From her small black clutch, Serafina withdrew a worn envelope, its edges softened by years of handling. She placed it on the table between them without a word, sliding it toward him with 2 fingers. Callum looked at it, then at her, then opened the flap and drew out a single photograph. Its surface faded with age. In the image stood a younger version of himself, standing beside a car that had clearly been in a serious accident. Twisted metal and shattered glass frozen in that one captured second. Callum recognized the photograph immediately, though it took him a moment to understand what he was truly looking at. This was a moment from his past that had never been documented, never photographed, never shared with anyone outside a small circle he had long since lost touch with. He asked her quietly where she had gotten it. Serafina answered that it came from a file she had long believed was destroyed, one she had spent 3 years trying to reconstruct piece by piece. She explained that 3 years earlier, her company had come dangerously close to losing control of assets worth billions of dollars, a catastrophe engineered so quietly that almost no one inside Vale Meridian had noticed the danger until it was nearly too late. Someone, an anonymous figure with no visible stake in the outcome, had intervened at the final possible moment. That person had taken no payment, had sought no credit, had left no name attached to the act, only 2 words scrawled across a single internal memo. "Do not sign." Serafina had spent 3 years trying to find the person behind those 2 words, following a trail that kept vanishing the moment she got close. Every lead had gone cold. Every name had turned out to be false. And now, sitting across from her at the back of a stranger's wedding, she finally understood who that person had been all along. Callum immediately denied it, insisting he had only performed a brief, unremarkable technical repair for Vale Meridian years earlier, nothing more than routine maintenance work that anyone in his former field could have done. But Serafina's eyes did not waver. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear it over the distant music. "You did not simply fix an error," she said. "You stopped something far larger than that, and I think you knew exactly what you were stopping." Callum's jaw tightened. The easy explanation he had rehearsed for years suddenly felt thin in his own mouth. Serafina held his gaze without blinking. And in that stillness, surrounded by hundreds of oblivious guests, she said the words that would unravel everything he had spent years trying to leave behind. "You saved my entire empire, and I have been trying to thank you ever since." What Serafina did not yet know was just how much of Callum's past remained buried beneath the quiet life he now led. Years before that wedding, Callum Voss had been one of the most gifted financial systems engineers in the industry. Though almost no one outside a small circle had ever known his name, he avoided recognition the way other men avoided debt. He had a rare, almost unsettling gift for noticing the exact place where a system's architecture concealed a flaw, the kind of flaw most analysts walked past 100 times without ever seeing. He never sought conferences, interviews, or public credit. He preferred the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem no one else could name, then disappearing before anyone thought to ask who had solved it. But a personal tragedy years earlier had pulled him entirely out of that world, a private family loss that reordered everything he valued and left him uninterested in returning to the corporate towers he once moved through so easily. From that point forward, Callum built a smaller, simpler life, one measured not in salary, but in the steadiness he could offer as a single father, raising a child largely on his own. He had spent years prioritizing that responsibility over any ambition of wealth or status, choosing stability over recognition every single time the two competed for his attention. His days now revolved around ordinary things, quiet mornings, dependable routines, and work that asked nothing of his name or his past. He no longer chased money, and he had made peace with a life that most of the guests in that glittering ballroom would have considered unremarkable, even beneath them. There had been a time, years earlier, when the same instincts he now used to notice a strained smile or a nervous glance had been used instead to notice a single misaligned decimal buried inside thousands of pages of financial modeling, the kind of error that could sink a company if left alone long enough. He had once been the person executives quietly called at midnight, when nothing else made sense, the man who could look at a wall of numbers and see, almost instinctively, the exact place where the story being told did not match the story being hidden. He had walked away from all of it without regret, choosing instead the far quieter work of packing lunches, attending parent conferences, and building a life around a responsibility that no boardroom could ever fully understand. He did not miss the recognition. He had simply never needed it in the first place. Serafina asked him plainly why he had never come forward to claim any reward for what he had done. A question she had turned over in her mind for 3 long years without a satisfying answer. Callum told her the truth, without embellishment. He had not saved her company for money. When she pressed further, asking what he had wanted instead, he fell silent for a moment, weighing whether the answer was even worth giving to a stranger. Finally, he said that he only wanted to understand why the danger had been created in the first place, not who had stopped it, but who had built it. That answer landed differently than Serafina expected. She had come searching for a hero to thank. Instead, she had found a man who had already moved past gratitude and straight into suspicion, someone who had never believed the near collapse of her company was an accident at all. Callum's quiet certainty told her something she had spent 3 years refusing to consider, that the danger to Vale Meridian had not come from outside forces or market misfortune, but from somewhere much closer to home. Serafina felt the ground shift slightly beneath the conversation, as though the man across from her held not just an answer, but a warning she was only now prepared to hear. Neither of them noticed, at first, the man standing near the edge of the stage, who had gone very still the moment he recognized the two of them speaking together. He watched for only a few seconds before turning and walking briskly out of the ballroom, weaving through waiters and guests with the urgency of a man trying not to look like he was running. The mood in the ballroom shifted for Serafina almost immediately, though nothing around them had visibly changed. She scanned the crowd with new attention and found the face she had been half expecting to see, a senior figure from her own company standing near the head table, with a drink he had not touched in several minutes. His name was Bennett Rourke, 52 years old, one of the most trusted advisors within Vale Meridian and a man Serafina had once considered nearly family. Bennett had helped her build much of what the company had become over nearly 2 decades, standing beside her through every acquisition, every crisis, every late night spent rewriting strategy on hotel stationery. He was, by every outward measure, the most loyal person in her professional life. But Callum noticed something the moment his eyes landed on Bennett across the room, something Serafina herself had missed entirely in the relief of the reunion. It was not surprise on Bennett's face. It was fear, sharp and immediate, the kind that flickers across a person's expression before they can control it. Callum leaned in and told Serafina quietly that she should stop speaking with him so openly in this room. When she asked why, his answer was simple and unsettling. Because that man over there already knows exactly who I am. Serafina glanced toward Bennett again, and this time he turned away almost too quickly, as if the act of looking back had cost him something. Callum explained, in a low and measured voice, that years earlier he had discovered an unusual pattern buried inside a routine set of financial transactions, small irregularities that individually meant nothing but together suggested something deliberately hidden. Just as he had begun tracing the pattern further, the entire file had been sealed without explanation, cut off from his access, as though someone had been watching his progress in real time. At that period, only a small handful of people held the clearance necessary to lock a file that quickly. And Bennett Rourke had been one of them. Serafina resisted the idea instinctively, the way anyone resists a betrayal they are not yet ready to name. Bennett had stood beside her for almost 20 years. He had helped her navigate hostile takeovers, board disputes, and family disagreements over inheritance that had nearly torn the company apart before it ever truly began. It felt impossible that the same man could be the source of the danger Callum was describing. But Callum offered something small and specific, a detail that could not be easily dismissed. A short alphanumeric code had appeared faintly in the corner of the old photograph she had given him, one belonging to a classified internal project. Serafina studied the code and felt something cold settle in her chest as recognition dawned. That project had been known to only 3 people in the entire company. One of them had died years earlier under circumstances everyone had accepted without question. The second person sitting at this very table was herself, and the third person, the one still very much alive and standing only a few tables away in a room full of witnesses, was Bennett Rourke. Serafina turned back to Callum, her composure cracking for the first time that evening, and asked the question that would change the direction of everything that followed. "If you are right about this," she said quietly, "then why would Bennett want me dead?" Callum began to wonder whether the wedding itself had ever truly been about a wedding at all. Too many details refused to line up as simple coincidence, starting with the timing of Serafina's arrival and ending with the presence of a man who clearly feared being seen speaking to him. Why had Serafina chosen tonight, of all nights, to finally step into public view after years of avoiding exactly this kind of gathering? Why had Bennett Rourke, a man who rarely attended social functions outside strict business necessity, made a point of being here as well? And strangest of all, why had Callum himself, a man with no wealth, no title, and no obvious connection to the bride's family, been invited in the first place? The answer, when it came, unsettled him more than he expected. It turned out the groom's business dealings extended directly into an active negotiation involving a partial acquisition of Vale Meridian assets, a deal quietly moving forward behind closed doors for months. Serafina admitted, in a voice that had grown noticeably careful, that she had come to this wedding specifically to meet a source, someone who had promised her information critical to understanding exactly how deep the threat inside her company truly ran. That contact, however, had not yet appeared, and the silence around their absence was beginning to feel less like a delay and more like a warning. Callum's old instincts returned to him almost against his will, the same instincts that had once made him invaluable inside rooms full of people who never noticed the smaller details. He began watching the room differently, tracking the movement of waitstaff who lingered too long near certain tables, noting the positions of security personnel stationed at exits that had no obvious reason to be guarded so heavily. He counted how many guests had quietly slipped out of the ballroom in just the last several minutes, more than seemed natural for any ordinary reception. Then his attention caught on something small and easy to overlook, a single phone resting on the edge of a table reserved for the most prominent guests. It did not belong to anyone seated nearby, and no one had reached for it since Callum had begun watching. He moved toward it slowly, careful not to draw attention, and the screen lit briefly with an incoming notification he was close enough to read. 11:15 tonight. Everything ends. He stepped back from the table slowly, careful not to draw the attention of the two men standing nearby in low conversation. Their postures a little too rigid for casual wedding chatter. One of them wore an earpiece disguised beneath his collar. The kind of detail only a man who once studied systems for a living would think to notice. Callum let his eyes move across the room once more, cataloging exits, counting faces he did not recognize among the catering staff, and feeling the old, familiar tightening in his chest that used to come right before he found something no one wanted found. Callum returned immediately to Serafina and told her what he had seen, watching her expression shift from confusion to genuine alarm as the meaning settled over her. She asked him what he believed was about to happen, and he admitted honestly that he did not yet know the specifics, only that the shape of it felt dangerously familiar. When she pressed him further, asking why a stranger's message on an unattended phone frightened him so deeply, his answer carried the full weight of experience rather than speculation. "Because I have seen a message like that before," he told her quietly, "and it never once meant something good." Serafina glanced instinctively at the clock mounted above the ballroom's grand entrance. And for the first time all evening, the elegant surroundings around them felt less like celebration and more like countdown, the minutes narrowing steadily toward 11:15 with no clear sense of what would happen when they ran out. Serafina led Callum away from the noise of the reception, through a quiet corridor to a small private room, usually reserved for wedding party preparations, now empty except for a single lamp and two chairs facing each other. For the first time that night, she allowed her practiced composure to fall away entirely, admitting things she had never said aloud to anyone outside her own closest circle. She was not, she told him plainly, entirely innocent in the story that had brought them both to this room. Years earlier, in the early ambitious stretch of building Vale Meridian into what it eventually became, she had placed enormous trust in a small group of advisors. Trust, she now understood, had been dangerously uneven. Bennett had helped her expand the company far beyond what she could have accomplished alone. Guiding acquisitions and negotiations with a steady hand she had come to rely on completely. But somewhere along the way, quietly and patiently, he had also begun constructing a network of influence entirely his own, one that answered to him long before it answered to her. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone unaccustomed to admitting weakness in front of another person. And Callum found himself listening not as a former engineer sizing up a problem, but as a man genuinely moved by the effort it clearly took her to be this honest. The lamp between them cast a soft light across the small room, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence carrying more weight than either was ready to fill with words. Serafina asked Callum directly for his help, untangling the full extent of what had been hidden inside her own systems, a request that clearly cost her something to make. Callum refused at first, telling her honestly that he had spent years deliberately staying away from that world and had no desire to be pulled back into it now, regardless of what was at stake. Serafina did not argue or plead. Instead, she told him simply that she was not looking for another employee to add to her payroll. She was looking for the one person left who was not afraid of her. Callum asked what exactly he would gain by agreeing to help her, and her answer surprised him more than any figure she could have offered. Freedom, she said, was the only thing she believed she could genuinely give him. When he pressed her to explain, she admitted she had quietly studied enough of his life to understand something important about the man in front of her. Callum had never wanted to become the wealthiest man in any room. He wanted only to stop being controlled by a past he had never fully resolved. She proposed placing him in charge of an independent fund, one built specifically to correct old mistakes buried deep within the company's history. Mistakes that had never been properly accounted for. Callum still hesitated, unwilling to commit so quickly to something with consequences he could not yet fully measure. But then Serafina said something quieter and far more honest than anything spoken between them so far. "I am not looking for you because of the money," she told him. "I am looking for you because I trust you." It was in that small, unguarded room, far from the noise and performance of the ballroom outside, that something began between them neither had expected nor planned. It was not sudden or theatrical, not the kind of instant spark found in careless romance. It grew instead from something steadier, built on mutual respect, and the strange intimacy of two people who now shared a secret large enough to reshape both their lives. Callum finally exhaled and said the words that would set everything in motion. "All right," he told her. "I will help you." What he did not yet know was that Serafina herself was still holding back the largest secret of all, one that would test everything they had just begun to build between them. The apartment he shared with no one now felt different in those first few nights of work. Papers spread across a table that usually held nothing more complicated than bills and grocery lists. He worked late into the night the way he used to years ago, a cup of coffee going cold beside him as he traced numbers across 3 separate monitors borrowed from a friend who no longer used them. It was strange, he thought, how quickly the old rhythm returned, as though the years away had only paused something rather than ended it. Callum began his investigation quietly, working through the fragments Serafina provided with the same patient precision that had once made him one of the sharpest minds in his field. Within days, he uncovered a shell company tied directly to Bennett Rourke, layered carefully through several intermediaries designed to obscure its true ownership from anyone conducting a routine review. It was exactly the kind of structure a man like Bennett would have known how to build, methodical and nearly invisible to anyone, without the patience to trace it back far enough. But as Callum dug deeper into the surrounding documents, a name he had not expected began appearing alongside Bennett's, threaded quietly through the same paperwork. It was Serafina's own name, attached to an authorization dated years earlier, one she had clearly not mentioned during their private conversation. Callum brought the documents directly to her, watching closely as her expression shifted from confusion to something heavier, something closer to guilt. Serafina admitted, without excuses, that she had signed a confidential agreement many years before, one she had believed at the time was routine and largely unremarkable. She had never imagined Bennett would eventually use that same agreement as a foundation for something far more damaging. But her signature, however innocently given, had been the very thing that opened the door Bennett later walked through unchallenged. Callum felt something cold settle between them, disappointment sharper than he expected given how quickly trust had formed between the two of them. "You did not tell me everything," he said, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm. Serafina did not try to soften the moment or explain it away. "I was afraid," she admitted, "that if you knew, you would walk away from all of this, and from me." Callum told her plainly that he despised being lied to, a wound that clearly ran deeper than this single conversation. Rooted in some earlier chapter of his life, he did not elaborate on. Serafina did not defend herself further. For the first time since Callum had met her, the most powerful woman in that ballroom allowed herself to appear genuinely vulnerable, stripped of the composure she wore like armor in every other setting. "I have lost too many people chasing money," she told him quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not want to lose another person chasing power." Something in Callum's expression softened as he watched her, no longer seeing a billionaire executive across the room, but a woman who had spent decades protecting an empire at increasing personal cost. Their fragile progress was interrupted before either of them could fully process what had just passed between them. Callum discovered, buried within a set of internal communications, that Bennett was preparing to release a document to the full board of directors within days, one carefully constructed to strip Serafina entirely of her control over the company she had spent her life building. The quiet war they had only just begun fighting together was about to become very public, and there would be no time left to prepare slowly. Bennett moved first, and he moved decisively. A carefully constructed document reached the board of directors within 48 hours, accusing Serafina of financial manipulation so serious it threatened both her leadership and her freedom. Shareholders reacted immediately, panic spreading through trading floors as the company's stock value dropped sharply within hours of the accusation becoming public. Bennett appeared before a cluster of financial reporters outside company headquarters, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling reluctant duty. "I am only protecting this company," he told them, his voice calm and convincing in a way that made Serafina's stomach turn when she watched the footage later that evening. Serafina found herself isolated almost overnight, watching colleagues who had stood beside her for years suddenly grow distant, unwilling to be seen defending someone under this level of scrutiny. Loyalty, she realized bitterly, had always been more fragile than she allowed herself to believe. But Callum did not retreat, and he did not hesitate. He returned fully to the skills he had spent years trying to leave behind, moving through spreadsheets and transaction records with the same quiet intensity that had once made him invaluable to institutions far larger than this one. Working through the night, Callum found what he was searching for buried inside Bennett's carefully constructed document. A single inconsistency small enough that most reviewers would have overlooked it entirely. It was nothing more than a discrepancy in formatting, an irregularity in how one particular dataset had been altered before submission. But that small flaw was enough to prove the entire document had been deliberately edited after the fact, undermining its credibility if Callum could gather enough supporting evidence before the board finalized its decision. He needed more than a single flaw to dismantle Bennett's carefully built case, so he returned once again to the old photograph Serafina had given him at the very beginning of this ordeal. Staring at the faint code visible in its corner, Callum spent hours cross-referencing it against archived project files, until a pattern finally began to emerge from the noise. The photograph, he realized, had never simply been evidence of what he had done years earlier. It was a key, deliberately encoded, leading directly toward an original set of records someone had tried very hard to erase completely. After hours of painstaking work, Callum finally located the deleted data, buried deep within an old backup system no one had thought to check. Bennett's name appeared exactly where Callum expected it to, confirming everything he had already suspected. But beside it, embedded in the same set of authorizations, was another name entirely. One that made Serafina go completely still the moment Callum showed her the screen. The person standing behind Bennett was not simply an ambitious employee acting alone. It was someone Serafina had once trusted more deeply than almost anyone else in her entire life. The emergency board meeting convened within days. The tension in the room, thick enough to feel from the moment the doors closed. Bennett arrived with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had already secured his victory. Greeting several board members with the easy familiarity of someone certain his position was unassailable. When Serafina entered with Callum walking quietly beside her, a murmur of confusion rippled through the room, several members exchanging uncertain glances at the unfamiliar man, now standing at her side. A senior board member finally asked the question hovering over the entire room. "Who exactly is this man, and why is he here?" Serafina answered without hesitation, her voice steady despite everything she had endured over the past several days. "He is the person you all tried to erase from this company's history," she told them. And every eye in the room turned toward Callum with renewed and uneasy interest. Callum walked the board through the evidence methodically, without theatrics or raised voices, laying out each discovery in the careful, deliberate order he had spent days assembling. He did not perform outrage or demand attention. He simply dismantled Bennett's carefully constructed narrative piece by piece, exposing the formatting inconsistency first, then the shell companies, then the deleted records that connected every thread together into a single, undeniable pattern. Bennett attempted to push back, offering explanations that grew increasingly strained as Callum calmly countered each one, having already anticipated nearly every argument Bennett would try to make. Eventually, the evidence made clear that Bennett had not acted entirely alone, that funds traced through multiple shell entities led directly to a second individual whose involvement Serafina had never once suspected. The full scope of the conspiracy unfolded before the stunned board, layer by layer, until nothing remained hidden. For a long moment after Callum finished speaking, no one in the room said anything at all. Bennett's confident posture had folded inward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing still holding him upright. One board member finally broke the silence, asking quietly how long Bennett had known his position was built on evidence that would not survive real scrutiny. Bennett offered no answer, and his silence spoke more clearly than any statement he could have made in his own defense. Bennett's authority within the company was stripped from him before the meeting even concluded, his carefully built case collapsing entirely under the weight of evidence he had never expected anyone to find. Serafina, meanwhile, was fully cleared of every accusation leveled against her. her reputation restored in the eyes of a board that had nearly abandoned her only days earlier. And yet, despite the clear victory, Callum found himself unable to feel entirely settled by what had just happened. He noticed something shifting in Serafina that went beyond simple relief. She no longer seemed interested in rebuilding her empire exactly as it had existed before, no longer content to continue running the company using the same instincts that had allowed someone like Bennett to operate undetected for so many years. She wanted, instead, to correct the things she had spent decades quietly overlooking. After the meeting ended, she found Callum waiting near the elevators, and she asked him softly where he intended to go next. "Home," he told her simply. "And what about me?" she asked. Callum looked at her for a long moment before answering. "That is something only you can decide." Serafina's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady in a way it had not been throughout the entire ordeal. "Then let me be the one who decides this time," she told him, and something in the quiet certainty of those words settled between them like the first calm moment either of them had known in weeks. Months passed, and Vale Meridian slowly transformed under the weight of everything that had come to light. Serafina voluntarily relinquished a portion of her own authority, redirecting significant resources toward a new initiative built specifically to support people the corporate world had quietly discarded over the years, much the way it had once discarded the man who eventually saved her company. Callum took on a role as an independent advisor, deliberately avoiding any title that would place him back inside the machinery of ambition he had walked away from so many years earlier. He never became the wealthiest man in any room he entered, and he never sought the kind of recognition that had followed Serafina throughout her career. He needed no elevated position, no headline, no seat at the head of any table. He simply continued living the same modest, deliberate life he had built for himself, long before any of this began. But something had changed, nonetheless, quietly and permanently. The people who mattered now understood exactly what he was worth, not in dollars, but in the steadiness he brought to every room he entered. The fund Serafina built in those following months quietly grew into something larger than either of them had initially imagined, reaching people who had spent years being overlooked by systems built to reward only the loudest voices in the room. Callum never asked for his name to be attached to any of it, content instead to watch the work unfold from a distance, offering guidance only when someone specifically sought it out. Serafina, for her part, began appearing less often at the kind of glittering events she once used to command a room, choosing instead the quieter meetings where real decisions were actually made. Eventually, the story circled back to where it had first begun, inside a ballroom filled with candlelight and quiet celebration. This was not the same wedding that had started everything months earlier. It was a smaller, private gathering held long after the chaos had settled, once every consequence had been faced and every truth had finally found its place. Callum arrived wearing the same simple, understated suit he always wore, unchanged by everything that had happened around him. Serafina crossed the room toward him, and this time there were no hundreds of eyes watching. No boardrooms waiting to pass judgment. No hidden agendas lingering beneath polite conversation. There was no empire to defend, and no conspiracy left to untangle. There were only two people who had each spent years being quietly alone in very different ways, finally standing together without anything left to hide. "Do you remember the first time I walked toward your table?" she asked him, a faint smile already forming at the corner of her mouth. "I remember," Callum answered. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "I thought you wanted to discuss business," he admitted. And Serafina laughed softly, the sound warmer and more unguarded than anything he had heard from her during those first tense weeks. "I thought the exact same thing," she told him, shaking her head slightly at how far they had both come since that night. Together they walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the noise and light for the quiet stillness of the evening air outside. The lesson embedded in every part of their story remained simple and unshakable. A man does not need wealth to hold real value, and a woman does not need power to be genuinely loved. And sometimes, without warning, an entire life changes direction in the exact moment a person believes they have been forgotten by the world around them. Before leaving, Callum paused and glanced back toward the small table near the rear of the room. The same kind of table he had once sat at completely alone, waiting for a night to end, so he could quietly disappear from a world that had never seemed to notice him. The chair sat empty now, catching the last soft light of the evening. He allowed himself a small, private smile at everything that distance now represented. Then he turned back toward Serafina, who was already watching him with an expression far gentler than the composed executive the world usually saw. She reached her hand out toward him, and without hesitation, Callum took it.